It probably comes as a great surprise to learn that CIA agents weren't always irredeemable deep state goons. Watch this 1983 interview with a former CIA operative who explains how he circulated disinformation by using mainstream media journalists at friendly media outlets like CNN and the New York Times. This video is more relevant today than it was when it was originally released in 1983. Former CIA agent Frank Schnepp carefully breaks down the process of laundering disinformation to the press in order to brainwash the masses into believing CIA and government narratives. Based on this testimony, the CIA would lie to journalists, float the same lie within their own agency and agencies in other countries so that journalists would corroborate it, and peddle false information through trusted media figures. And if you think he's lying, consider that the US government sued Schnepp all the way to the Supreme Court, which ultimately ruled intelligence workers had to submit any statement for censorship by the agency, even those unrelated to secrets.
You briefed the press, did you not, when you were there?
Well, I had several jobs. One of my jobs was that of analyst. I also was an interrogator and indeed briefed the press when we, the CIA, wanted to circulate disinformation on a particular issue. Disinformation is not necessarily a lie. It may be a half-truth. And we would pick out a journalist. I would go do the briefing and hope that he would put the information in print. For instance, if we wanted to get across to the American public that the North Vietnamese were building up their force structure in South Vietnam, I would go to a journalist and advise him that in the past 6 months, X number of North Vietnamese forces had come down the Ho Chi Minh Trail system through southern Laos. Now, there is no way a journalist can check that information. So either he goes with the information or he doesn't, and ordinarily or usually the journalist would go with it because it looked like some kind of exclusive. And I would say our percentage planning that kind of data was 70 to 80%. The correspondents we targeted were those who had terrific influence, the most respected journalists in Saigon, like Robert Chaplin of the New Yorker magazine, Kai's Beach of the Los Angeles Times from time to time, and also he worked for the Chicago Daily News. Bud Merrick of U.S. News and World Report, Malcolm Brown of the New York Times, even Maynard Parker of Newsweek magazine. We would go after these gentlemen. I would be directed to cultivate them, to spend time with them at the Caravel Hotel or the Continental Hotel, to socialize with them, and slowly but surely to try to gain their confidence by dolloping out valid information which was true. And then I would drop into a conversation the data that we wanted to get across which might not be true. One piece of data, for instance, that we managed to plant in the New Yorker magazine had to do with a supposed North Vietnamese effort in 1973 to develop airfields along the border of South Vietnam. The reason we wanted to plant this information was that we were trying to persuade the U.S. Congress that Saigon should continue to get a great deal of aid, and that the North Vietnamese were the chief violators of the ceasefire accord. That was printed in the New Yorker magazine under the byline of Robert Chaplin, as indeed was a great deal of such information which we tried to circulate. If I planted a piece of information with a reporter, I would ordinarily then try to create an environment in which he could not check the information. I would go to the British ambassador and brief him on the disinformation I had just given the reporter. So when the reporter wanted to cross-check what I'd told him with, say, the British ambassador, New Zealand ambassador, or what have you, he would get false confirmation, the same message coming back at him, and he'd say, aha, I've got proof that Frank Schnepp told me the truth, when in fact what he'd gotten was simply an echo of what I'd given him in the first place via the British ambassador or other of our friendly diplomatic contacts. I am, as an ex-CIA agent, opposed to the disinformation activities in which I was involved. I admit that I was involved, and I think it served no useful purpose. Propagandizing the American public or Congress is not the CIA's job.
There is a movement on social media that attempts to whitewash any negative publicity about the CIA by claiming that the agency doesn't engage in that sort of behavior anymore. Whether it's lying to Congress, drug trafficking, illegally spying on American citizens, or covertly operating programs without congressional knowledge, the CIA is a law unto itself. In 2017, WikiLeaks published more than 8,000 documents on the CIA. The confidential documents, codenamed Vault 7, dated from 2013 until 2016 and included details on the CIA's software capabilities, such as the ability to compromise cars, smart TVs and web browsers, including Google Chrome, Microsoft Edge, Firefox and Opera, as well as the operating systems of most smartphones, including Apple's iOS and Android. If you think that the CIA and your government suddenly stopped lying to you sometime in the last 40 years, you are hopelessly naive. According to Amber Lyon, a 3-time Emmy Award-winning journalist, CNN is routinely paid by the US government and foreign governments to selectively report on certain events and make up fake news stories. Making matters even worse, according to Amber Lyon, the Obama administration paid CNN for editorial control over some of their content.
I really worry here that the United States public is being led into another potential conflict with Iran, the similar way that we were led into the Iraq and Afghanistan wars, because you're starting to see the mainstream media really overhype the situation in Iran and omit important facts like what you just showed, Liz, where Ahmadinejad was saying that there are options for peace. But if you go back and you look at the way that CNN and other mainstream outlets covered that, they ignored that part of the speech. And if you look at all the propaganda being fed to the American public right now in terms of Iran, we have movies here coming out, Argo. We've got the mainstream media oversaturation of coverage of the Iran situation. And, you know, based on everything that's happening here in the U.S. with the mortgage crisis, the economy, the fact that most Americans are having problems just getting by day to day, the fact that the mainstream media is over-covering Iran only says one thing to me, and that's that the American public is being propagated into another war, Liz.
And why do you think that this is happening?
Well, I think that it's a use of propaganda, and this is something that goes back to the terms weapons of mass destruction. The American public was fed that phrase over and over and over leading into the Iraq war, and now we're starting to see it as far as nuclear weapons and Iran goes in the U.S., Liz, and I just fear that the public is continuing to be fed propaganda that unassuming Americans don't realize they're being fed to lead us into another potential conflict.
Now, the job of the media is supposed to be, this fourth estate and to, show, all possible angles and basically just to report the truth. What do you think it is? I know that you worked for CNN. Why would it be otherwise? Why would they be presenting war propaganda, as you call it?
Well, I really can't speculate as to exactly why this is going on, but I can tell you that when I was working for CNN, we did have a documentary that we aired on the Bahrain situation, and that's where we have our naval base, which is right across from Iran, so we strategically want to keep that naval base, and it was very difficult to get stories on about Bahrain. I even came out a couple weeks ago talking about the censorship of that documentary on CNN International. And above all, Liz, I feel that the American public is not being fed the true story about what's going on in this region. And it's very dangerous, because when the public is constantly fed messages that are potentially leading us into a war that may not be necessary, it's not fair to the American people, and it's not fair to journalism, because the truth isn't being told here. What's being told here is the way that these networks networks want to spin the truth, and that's leading us into another potential conflict with Iran. And I've been trying to tell my followers on my Facebook page and on Twitter to really open your eyes, because once you notice and start to you take the blindfold off, you start to see all of this anti-Iran propaganda floating through the American mainstream media, and it's symbolic of exactly what was going on before the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, Liz.
Now, we do have a clip of this documentary that you filmed. Want to take a look at it, and then we'll talk more about the documentary and the way CNN reacted to it.
The protesters seem to have disappeared from Bahrain's capital thanks to the intense military crackdown. We ventured into another side of Bahrain, a side the government didn't want the world to see, to find out where they've gone. We drove to the Shia villages, passing military checkpoints as we left the capital.
So we're gonna hang out with these protesters for a little bit.
This is what the protests look like today. Young boys who've been hit with tear gas.
Now, the documentary that we just saw a clip of never aired. It never aired on CNN International. Why not?
Well, I still haven't been given an exact reason as to why it didn't air. I went and visited with the president of CNN International, Tony Maddox, twice on behalf of my dumbfounded crew, and we were never given an answer. And so I started investigating the situation, Liz, after several employees who'd been at the network for years approached me and said, you need to look into this, there's something going on. It's very strange they're not airing your documentary. And after some investigation, we found out that CNN International is actually making money from the Bahrain regime. They are a customer of Bahrain. Bahrain is paying CNN International to create content that shows Bahrain in a favorable light, and then also not only to create that content, Liz, to then air that content on CNN International. And in one of the shows, it was called I List Bahrain. It was back in 2010. It was sponsored by Bahrain. And Richard Quest was live from the country for a week talking about the Formula One race and how progressive Bahrain was and how the Crown Prince was a reformer. Well, we saw in February 2011 that under the Crown Prince's rule, the military troops shot and killed unarmed protesters in broad daylight. And this is very dangerous, because what CNN is doing, and they're not only taking money from just Bahrain, they've also produced similar content for Georgia, Kazakhstan, and other nations as well, Lebanon. And what makes this dangerous is they're not disclosing to the viewers that these sponsored programs are actually being sponsored. Or if they are disclosing it, it's in very small gray lettering at the bottom of the article. And that's dangerous not only to our foreign policy, but once again, making the American public and the public in general that's watching this network think that there are rosy situations happening in these countries when that's not the case, as we've seen with Bahrain. And it's defrauding viewers, and it's defrauding their own journalists. I was not told, as a journalist working at the network, that this was going on. It wasn't clearly disclosed to me that at the same time I was investigating the Bahrain regime, Bahrain was a paying customer at CNN, Liz.
And you did this you found this out all through your own research. What did CNN tell you in terms of when you were like, hey, why aren't you playing my documentary that I risk danger and to bring this story? And what did they tell you as to, why they weren't playing it?
Well, that's what made me more suspicious, is because they never gave us an answer. They never told us why they weren't playing it, even though I asked the head of CNN International twice about it, and even bosses above me told me they didn't have answers for me, and I'd have to go searching for those answers. So that pretty much, as an investigative reporter, tells me that something's going on. And so on behalf of my crew, who, I got to get to the bottom of things, Liz. I mean, we had fixers and drivers in Bahrain who are currently now have been laid off because they helped us film that documentary. Some who are continually still harassed. Doctors Without Borders employee who actually drove us into these villages to show us doctors who'd been beaten by security forces. He risked his safety. Several months after our documentary, his home was burnt down, and in part activists say because he helped CNN with that documentary. I mean, these sources, these people on the ground did not know that at the same time CNN was taking money from this regime to make rosy content that would negate their content. And they risked their lives. And I feel like CNN owes them an apology, as well as an apology to viewers and its own journalists for defrauding them with this information, Liz.
Wow, Amber, really, really eye-opening, and really appreciate you coming on the show.
The scary fact is that the mainstream media is a cesspool of manipulation and thought control, and 99% of people have no clue about what's going on. If this surprises you, you need to get yourself up to speed. In 2012, Obama reversed the Smith-Montt Act, meaning domestic audiences can be targeted by government propaganda. Propaganda and fake news have been a hot topic since then, especially since media favourite Hillary Clinton lost the 2016 election. If you are wondering what Obama's handiwork looks like in practice, consider this Exhibit A for the prosecution. Multiple mainstream media outlets were caught reading from the same script and advancing an identical propaganda narrative following the FBI raid on former President Donald Trump's home at Mar-a-Lago.
Sources tell ABC News there's been a strong reaction to the raid on extremist and QAnon-related forums.
Sources say there's been a strong reaction to the raid on extremist and QAnon-related forums.
Sources also telling ABC News there's been a strong reaction from some extreme groups online, including QAnon and other groups.
There's been a strong reaction to the raid on extremist and QAnon-related forums,
including those that were active before January 6th.
Including those that were active prior to January 6th.
Including those that were active prior to January 6th.
Involved in the January 6th insurrection.
Including those that were active prior to the January 6th riot.
Some have been calling for violence and even a civil war.
Some of them include calls for violence and even a civil war.
Some of them include calls for
violence in online forums
and even civil war.
This was the top comment on the search on the pro-Trump site The Donald last night. Quote, lock and load with references to a civil war.
Talking very violently about civil war.
Searches for civil war spiked.
They're talking about civil war. Civil war. Civil war.
Civil war. Civil war. Civil war.
The disturbing footage of mainstream media talking heads repeating the exact same scripted lines demonstrates the way the public are force-fed government propaganda. Which raises the question, what do they have to hide and why are they so determined to make everybody see these events in the same way? This is mind control in action. There is a reason they are called programs and programming, and it's far from the first time the media has been caught parroting from the same propaganda script. It's called Operation Mockingbird, and we made a whole video exposing its shady CIA history. I'll put a link in the description box below. In the meantime, keep your mind open and refuse to participate in the mass formation psychosis afflicting the viewers of mainstream media. The future of our world depends on you.